Derek Fisher and I are going to discuss application security. Derek is leader at American Financial Technology Corporation and author of this book, Application Security Program Handbook, which I recommend highly. Derek, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Happy to be here.
So maybe you could give us a little bit of your background and what you're doing these days at work.
Yeah, so as Jeff mentioned, I head a product security function at a large financial technology company. If you look me up, you'll know who it is. I just, as the general statement goes, the things that I express here today are my own and don't represent my company. So again, if you look me up, you'll figure that out. So my team, our job is to provide software security to the applications that we develop internally within the organization. And we have applications that perform a lot of different financial functions, not just for advisors, but for credit and for bank accounts, for aggregation. We have a lot of different financial touch points with our applications. And we are starting to branch out into other areas as well, which expands our scope. So obviously, from a product security standpoint, the code that we develop and the software we develop has a very high risk to the function of the organization and really puts a lot of pressure on the security team and the development team to ensure that we're developing code in a secure manner. So there's a lot of different ways that we can provide software security. As Jeff mentioned, I wrote a book on providing or how to build a product security function within an organization. There's a lot of stuff in there for those that are new to it. There's things in there for those that have experience in it. But it's generally been my experience in text format in terms of building a product security function.
And can you give us a sense of how big your program is, like in terms of apps or developers, or what's the scale of what we're talking about here?
So we have 100 Scrum teams, and there's give or take maybe 10 to 15, but we're around 100 Scrum teams, and so we have multiple business units. That the way I usually describe it is, several business units, each business unit with several products. Each product has several pipelines and development teams, and so it's a large function. There's a lot of coverage, and my product security team, this is probably one of the largest product security teams that I've managed, and it's still we're very, very much busy on a daily basis. So it's a lot of area to cover.
So let's jump into it. I just mentioned the U.S. cybersecurity strategy and transparency and liability around apps and APIs. So maybe you could describe a few of the key pillars of your AppSec program that help you be ready for this new world.
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges, right? We can't be everywhere all the time, all at once. So we have to rely on, number one, our tooling, but we also have to rely on being able to build a build security mindset into our engineering processes. And so product security, application security, we're very good at being able to stand up tools, find vulnerabilities, and throw them at development teams. That's we've been doing that for a long time. We know how to do that. But the questions around being able to identify vulnerabilities that are truly exploitable, ones that are truly actionable, and being able to really give the development team the ability to really identify their own vulnerabilities and be able to resolve those vulnerabilities is where I believe we really need to shift.
That's interesting. So is it empowering the development teams to do this job for themselves?
Yep.
rather
Yeah.
than run it through a central AppSec team that's kind of becomes a bottleneck? Is that kind of the philosophy there?
Yep. Yeah. And in fact, not to pitch the book here, but there is a chapter on decentralized, application security, which is really, kind of the model that I've been trying to drive in my day job. And that is, that again, we can't be everywhere all the time. So we have to be able to give the developers the tools to be able to, identify those issues and solve them on their own.
You've mentioned creating a paved road from GitHub to AWS. So I'm wondering, how does that simplify the problem for both your team and your development teams?
Well, it gets my team out of the critical path. I think a lot of times I'm trying to fight to get my team out of that critical path, and because we don't want to be seen as blockers, right? And I think that's one of the things with security is that the historical version of security is that you're just there to say no, and I think we really need to be in a different position to be able to say yes, and also be able to really empower the developers to develop code in such a way that they feel that security is not something that they have to be concerned about, that it's there, it's baked in, it's part of the ingredients.
So that's interesting that, you're off the critical path. I think that's really smart. For a long time, I've said security teams should be more like coaches and toolsmiths.
Yep.
But I'm wondering, how do you interact with the development teams? Like, how would you characterize that relationship, since it's not like a gate or a guard or anything, it's something different? How would you characterize it?
So we are, sort of transitioning away from what we would have typically done is embed somebody in the Scrum teams. And
like
so,
a champion.
Yeah. And before, we were expanding our champions team to provide much broader coverage where we will have, coverage across all the Scrum teams. But, that before expanding our champions team, it was people from my team going to be part of multiple Scrums, and that's very difficult. It doesn't scale.
Right.
So the way, that I really like to try to view this is, providing application security as a service, or ensuring that the tools are available for the development team to be able to utilize. And as you mentioned, that my team is more people that are building that security ecosystem around the engineering function.
And you've been talking mostly about development side of things, pre-prod. Tell me a little bit about what your team does in production.
So a lot of what we do is runtime protection. We get involved with the runtime protection, running a web application firewall, obviously vulnerability management, some threat intelligence in terms of being able to stay ahead of the new threats that are coming out, and being able to put that into what does that mean for our business, right? What does that mean for our products? So that's really where we focus on the operational side.
I think that's really smart, by the way. No, too many organizations don't really understand what's going on in production from a security perspective, and then they can't feed that back into development and complete that feedback loop. So kudos for setting that up. All right, let's talk about shift left for a second. I think it's a little bit of a controversial term. I think initially the idea was good, but over the past few years, we've started to see a lot of blowback from enterprises that have tried shift left, based on, when you shift too far left, you lose a lot of context, and then you get lots of false positives and sort of bad effects follow. So, we've been pushing more of a shift smart strategy. I'm wondering, how do you think about the shifting part of application security?
Yeah, I think the principle of shift left makes sense, right? I think in practical and implementation, it gets, as you mentioned, it gets a little sticky, right? Because you do find we'll take static analysis as kind of like the whipping boy of shifting left, right? You integrate a SaaS tool, you find a lot of vulnerabilities. It's noisy. It's, as you mentioned, it's not, there's no context. It's not in a running environment. and the SaaS tools flagging vulnerabilities that are just not vulnerabilities, right? And you spend most of your time trying to weed out the false positives. That's not a good use of time. Shifting smart, right? I think that's one of the things that I've really tried to focus on in the past few years is building this product security as opposed to this application security, where really means the full life cycle, right? It's not we don't integrate SaaS and then throw reports at development and say go fix these and never talk to them again. We want to make sure that we have a secure software development lifecycle that is robust and is able to identify findings throughout the lifecycle, but more importantly, understand which one of these are actually exploitable, which one of these are actually a risk to the organization, so that we can put our focus in the right place.
It sounds like you're focused on really the effectiveness of the program as well as the efficiency of the program, and you have to kind of balance those things, right? I'm curious what kind of metrics you're using, off the top of your head, maybe just a few of the key metrics that when you think about your program, what do you value?
Coverage is one thing. Same way that we look at code coverage, right? For testing, I think we're trying to approach it the same way with product security, in the sense that where do we have the right coverage from lines of code compared to security, applying security. Vulnerability management is always a tried and true way of metrics gathering. Are we seeing the criticals hopefully disappearing? One of the great metrics that we see is when we have 0 criticals open at any given time. Some of the other metrics that I'm focused on right now is we have a pretty robust training program, and as I mentioned, a champions program as well. And one of the things I'm really trying to zero in on is what's the correlation there between training versus vulnerabilities? Are we seeing new vulnerabilities opened with teams that have a higher rate of training compared to ones that don't? So because I think that one of the things with security in general, not just application security and product security, but it's really, where's the value? Right. And I think we're always seen as a cost center. But, if we can prove that we're saving the company money by, integrating these tools and really focusing on the right things while reducing risk, that's really where we want to hone in on the metrics.
I love that you're actually measuring the fact that, you're seeing the rate of new vulnerabilities for projects to try to figure out which of the practices you're doing is actually leading to those outcomes. That's really smart. That's something that we try to encourage all our customers to do. Is you can measure it right with contrast, is look for the rate at which new vulnerabilities are being introduced, and hopefully that's going down. If it is, then you're probably headed in the right direction.
Yep.
I want to switch gears here a little bit and talk about open source libraries. It's kind of all the rage these days. I guess from my perspective, it's definitely one thing that AppSec programs ought to deal with. How do you think about improving open source security?
I mean, it's an easy problem to solve. It's just nobody wants to. I mean, it's there's challenges, right? I think the easy way to solve this, right, is that you have a internal repository that is managed by your company that goes through a very robust approval process where only these 15 libraries are ever used in any of your products. That's not realistic, right? It just doesn't, software doesn't get made that way. So there are ways to be able to identify vulnerabilities in third-party libraries, through your secure software development lifecycle, through the tooling that you have in place. But one of the things that I think we sort of miss is that identifying, as I mentioned, identifying vulnerabilities is easy, right? We can do that. It really comes down to what's your response to that. And so, if you have a third-party library, many of us probably remember Log4j, 2 years ago, where, yeah, okay, we have this 0 day, everyone freaks out. And it really comes down to those that didn't freak out knew that, okay, we have a process in place to get this resolved in production in a relatively quick way, or we feel comfortable that we can monitor for this, and we know we're going to get through this. So I think the challenge is not just identifying those vulnerabilities, but it's really, what is your response to that? You're going to have 0 days. You're going to have libraries that are running in production that are not vulnerable today, but are vulnerable tomorrow. What is your response to that?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It's not a terrifically complicated problem, but you do have to have some infrastructure and you have to have some process in place to manage it. And as you mentioned, most library vulnerabilities certainly are not exploitable. I think people are saying, roughly 90% are not exploitable. Certainly, we've measured it with contrast that at least 62% of open source libraries are never loaded. They're never even get into memory. So that's like an easy way to chop off a big chunk of the problem.
Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback on that, going back to the Log4j situation, I mean, for those of us that were involved with that, you find out that the percentage of where you were actually exploitable in that was very small. It wasn't 100%. So.
From the audience here about decentralized security that I thought I'd bring up. So they ask, hey, decentralizing security is great, but that means that you're trusting the development teams that are building this code. How do you make sure they don't turn off checks or just game the system in some way to allow their code to go into production?
Yeah, and you can typically do that through your CI/CD, depending on what technology you're using there. The other, there's automated ways of doing that through that pipeline. Or the other option is, if you don't have that ability, is to play basic auditor, where you do spot checks, periodically, and they're, and make that determination from that. But obviously the automated way is the more preferred method.
Yeah, my experience is that kind of happens more if your tools are super inaccurate and people feel like they're wasting a lot of time. But if your tools are good tools, then development teams want to do the right thing. So that's my experience. Last question, coming back to runtime protection. I'm curious how you see the value from runtime protection, and what are your recommendations for people that are building web apps and web APIs around runtime protection?
I mean, the best way to look at runtime protection is the fact that it buys you time, right? That's the simplest sales pitch for runtime protection, is that in those cases where, for instance, I'll go back to Log4j, where okay, you have this 0 day that just got plopped on your lap a week before Christmas, and the question comes up, okay, now what? And you start digging around for your controls. What protective controls do you have in place? What detective controls do you have in place? What will help any organization is the ability to block active attacks while you remediate the actual issue. And runtime protection gets you that time to do that remediation. That we call it virtual patching, right? It provides this blocking mechanism and allows you time.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I was really excited, when Log4Shell came out, and Spring4Shell, and the Atlassian flaws, and even the recent SQL injection with JSON. Contrast runtime protection was there. We identified those attacks and kept those applications safe to give you that time to go back and fix the application the right way, go replace libraries and things like that. So yeah, that's a really powerful use case for runtime protection. Anything you'd like to share with the audience, before we finish up?
No, I think, glad I got the opportunity to talk about this. I think, software security is, I believe that, I've been in engineering for a long time and seen kind of the the shift from security being protecting the hard, outer shell and with the GUI center. And I think we're starting to really see that kind of transition in the past, several years, where we are getting more traction on the product security side, and people are starting to see the value that, if you are able to stop vulnerabilities from going into production, you have less reliance on those, those hard outer shell controls. So I'm happy to see that occurring in the field. So.
Well, thanks, Derek. It's a little understated. Derek runs a fantastic AppSec program that's really firing on all cylinders, taking advantage of a lot of contrast technologies. But I think they're really doing a great job. So thank you for sharing a little on your program, and we look forward to talking with you soon.
Yeah, appreciate it, Jeff. Thanks.